Brendan, there are some things in pop culture that sometimes just ring really, really true, even when they don't intend to. And there's this television show that was really popular for a while. I wasn't really into it. But this sage on this show gives these three truths that should be self-evident, and they are...
I know what you're going to say. I already know what you're going to say.
Beats, Bears, Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah. 100%.
Right?
100%.
Now, I don't think he was talking about the right type of beats.
Right.
But, there's some truth in every untruth. So like beats...
if we would look at the original transcripts and the manuscripts, we might see that we've translated the wrong beats there.
Yeah.
If we go back and look at the writers, I'm sure it was BEATS.
Oh, 100%. It's definitely a mistranslation. It was they didn't look at the real...
The fragments weren't all the way there, and so just like a hey and a het in I believe it's those two letters, if I can remember right, in the Hebrew, look almost exactly alike. One's connected and one's not. That's what happened in those manuscripts with the E and the A.
Without a doubt.
Right.
Yeah.
Dwight was right.
Yeah, Dwight was right. And
Beats, Bears, and Battlestar Galactica.
Right.
Yeah.
And Bears are going to play a big part in what we have to talk about today.
That's right.
Battlestar Galactica, not so much. Although it's interesting to bring up Battlestar Galactica, because I don't know if did you watch Battlestar Galactica?
I kind of did. I was always more so. I watched a lot more Star Trek, and I watched what was not Seagate? What is the
Sequest?
No. What's the
Stargate?
Stargate. I was like
Stargate SG-1. Yeah.
Seagate is the hard drives for computers. I was like,
But there was like a Sequest, which was like space underwater.
Oh, that sounds cool. Okay,
interesting.
No,
But
so I wasn't a big Battlestar Galactica guy.
Well, like the underlying thing behind Battlestar Galactica, this is going to sound so funny, is actually it's steeped in Mormonism.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's actually, they take a lot from Mormon doctrine and concepts. Now, it's not word for word, page for page.
Sure.
But they use a lot of those. They use them as thematic elements for the show. There's the Lost 13th.
That's hilarious.
Thing, and there's all these. It's very interesting, and there is a bit of religious dogma to it too, which is kind of interesting. Yeah,
interesting.
It was an interesting show. You watch it or don't. We have it on like box DVDs.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
That we've never opened. We watched it streaming originally. Oh. Anyway, so beats are important.
Beats are important.
And bears are important to our conversation today.
Correct.
So we're going to talk about, and you and I have done this a couple times now. We take some scriptures that are maybe hard to understand, hard to get our head around, or give us an impression of, what was God doing there?
Right.
And for some people, it becomes a stumbling block. It becomes a situation where it's like, I look at that and I say, how can God be good and he do this?
Right.
And so we try to look at some of these difficult passages, right? And we've already talked about one specific case of mauling in the Bible.
Yes.
We talked about the lion and the prophet, right? And that happened near Bethel, which is where all of the good maulings take place.
Every mauling, yeah.
Because today we're going to talk about the 2 she-bears that come out at Bethel and maul the 42 youths. Utes.
Which is actually one of and I'm not even like joking. This is one of my favorite stories in the Bible.
It's a very interesting story.
Like it is interesting. It's kind of comical. I mean, if you look at this story, now, some are going to read this and be like, Brandon, you have a very sick sense of humor. But I really genuinely do. When I read this the first time, I was like, there's no way this is in the Bible.
Right. But it is.
It is
100% there.
Yes.
So why don't we just read it real quick and then we'll talk through some of the ins and outs.
Yes.
Okay. So this story actually takes place at the end of 2 Kings chapter 2, and it's verses 23 through 25. Now he, Elisha, went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up by the road, some young boys came out from the city and ridiculed him and said to him, "Go up, you bald head! Go up, you bald head!" When he looked behind him and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 of the boys. He then went on from there to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. So I like how it just continues without any concern for the 42 boys, right?
I love it.
Okay. So I think just in reading that, taking it literally, it doesn't sound like there's some elements of this that you're like, wait, what?
Right.
What happened?
That's why if you don't really understand what's happening here, which we're going to talk about, this seems like a very strange story. Like, why would the author even include this?
Right.
If you don't understand what's actually happening. You see what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
because you're like, okay, so you're reading before this. He's just kind of, when we're going to talk about who Elisha actually is, but there's context that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Then this story, and then it just keeps going. And so it's kind of like, why did they decide that they could have left this part out, context, and then just gone on to the rest of the story?
Right.
They didn't need this, but there's a reason why it's here.
As there's a reason why it's here. And context is so important. We've talked about it before in different episodes.
For sure.
And a phrase I've heard lately that resonates with me on this is the Bible was written for you, but it wasn't written to you.
Right.
Right? So understanding the context of who it was being written to, why it was being written, who was doing the writing.
For sure.
Changes the way you might, consider this.
You have to read it for who it's being written to.
Right.
Right.
Which is why, so a great example of this, people today would be like, well, if these biographies of Jesus are so real, then why don't they talk about his youth really?
Right.
It's like, well, because ancient biographers said if nothing important happened in their youth, don't include it.
Don't write about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Because it's too expensive. There's, so
right. Don't waste your breath.
Yeah.
Right.
There's too much context there.
God actually says that.
Yeah.
God says if you're going to talk, make it worth saying.
Make it worth saying.
And I think that biographers have done that too. And so there's a reason why Elisha is with this story here, given the context of Elijah before him. So I'll let you get into some context here.
Yeah. So let's talk about who Elisha was.
Mm-hmm.
So Elisha was a disciple or a follower or a student of a man named Elijah. Right?
Yes.
These guys get confused all the time. And Elijah was a powerful prophet who we see a lot of stories about what he did throughout 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, Elisha was not the only person who followed Elijah or who was in the prophetic movement. 2 Kings 2 mentions a group known as the sons of the prophets, and they mentioned them in verses 3, 5, 7, and 15. And they're in 3 different cities, Gil, Jericho, and Bethel. Okay. Now, in verse 3, the sons of the prophets seem to hold Elisha in very high regard.
Right.
As they discuss with him that Elijah is going to be called up into heaven that day, right? And in fact, this is what they say. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel went out to Elisha and said to him, "Are you aware that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?" And he said, "Yes, I am aware. Say nothing about it." Right? Now, the context of the importance of this is, and we're going to talk a little bit more about who these people were, but the sons of the prophets saw Elisha as the successor to Elijah.
Yeah, right.
Right? They definitely saw this as being something, and they also they held both of these men in pretty high regard.
Right.
And so it looks like Elisha is going to be the next dude.
Right.
The guy who goes and talks to the
Right. He's
kings.
been recognized as the successor. Correct.
Right, exactly.
And Elijah has done so many crazy things that he's gained a reputation.
Right.
So there's that respect there. Yeah.
Right. And so this is all happening in 2 Kings chapter 2, which is where we are in this story with the Bears, right? So this is all taking place in context of each other.
Right.
So if we look at 2 Kings 2, 9 through 14, it says, "When they had crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, 'Ask me what I should do for you before I am taken from you.' And Elisha said, 'Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me.' He said, 'You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so.' And as they were walking along and talking, behold, a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire, and they separated the two of them. Then Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven, and Elisha was watching it, and he was crying out, 'My father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen.' And he did not see Elijah again. Then he took hold of his own clothes and tore them in 2 pieces. He also took up the coat of Elijah that had fallen from him. And he went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the coat of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the waters and said, 'Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?' And when he also had struck the waters, they were divided here and there, and Elisha crossed over." So this is the succession, right?
Right.
There's a couple interesting things. So that bit at the end when he crosses the Jordan.
Right.
That's what Elijah did to cross over the first time.
First time, yeah.
Right. And somebody, I read this in some commentaries. This is also a what happens for Joshua.
Yeah.
When Joshua crosses over.
Sure.
Right. So there's always some like prototyping happening.
Well, what's happening here is Elisha, with a S, is basically in some ways testing what Elijah just said. He said, if you're going to be my successor, because that's what he's asking. He says, I'm going to be your successor, so I need a double portion. I need to be able to do what you did and then some. Like I can't do this on my own.
Right.
So he's kind of doing that here, literally picking up the mantle, and before he goes out and becomes the next Elijah, he's saying, "Can I do it?" And this is that.
Right.
It's a ritual almost.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I find it interesting that you mentioned the double portion. I have heard this preached before that Elisha does twice as many recorded miracles as Elijah.
Really? Huh.
I don't know the truth of that. I've heard it preached though.
Sure.
But like if you look into commentaries, this was not really about having twice the power
Right.
of Elijah. This was what he asked for is exactly what an heir would be asking for from their father.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Like the primary inheritance went to the firstborn.
Right.
He's asking to be the
right.
heir.
Right.
So when this ordeal is over, it is proven that it has worked, right? Because Elisha performs the same miracle that Elijah had. And in verse 15, the sons of the prophets recognize that anointing is on Elijah, and it now they recognize that the anointing that was on Elijah now rests on Elisha because they saw them go and they saw him return. Right. So it is at this point we have this established.
Right.
That God's prophet in the land of Israel, the guy he's using the most to deal with the wickedness of Israel.
Yes.
Right. And to preach against the wickedness and to go up against those who would set themselves against God. He is going up to heaven.
Right.
And Elisha is taking over.
He's taking on the mantle. Yes.
Right. So, and those who serve God, the sons of the prophets, they are witnesses to this.
Right.
This is an interesting aside. They're on a mountain.
Yeah.
When he goes up. When Moses sees God, he's on a mountain.
Huh.
Who is on the mountain with Jesus at the Transfiguration?
It's just inner circle, the disciples.
Well, and who appears? Moses
and
Elijah.
Yeah, Elijah. Interesting.
And so I've heard somebody posit this. It's more of a like there's no proof of this.
Sure.
But is that who they were seeing?
Interesting.
Was this like outside of time?
Yeah. For sure.
Because Moses sees the promise. Right. As God walks by. And Elijah is called up.
Right.
Like, is that
interesting?
Is that who's calling him up? Is that what those conversations are?
Yeah.
Right. It's very interesting. It's very interesting to think about. There's not a lot more you can do with that than think about it.
Sure.
But it was an interesting thing.
Or maybe you got to go to a mountain and see if it happens.
Yeah, go to a mountain. Yeah. Maybe it needs to be a specific mountain. Okay. So why don't we talk a minute about who the sons of the prophets were?
Yes.
Okay. So per Bible Gateway, they say that the term is a technical one referring to the members of a prophetic order or guild, and it has no reference to physical descent from a prophet. So the sons of the prophets were basically a guild who served God and kind of lived in this prophetic lifestyle.
Right.
They were
strangely enough, they were like the Mandalorians.
This is the way.
Like this is the way. Exactly. I kind of mean that in that way. Like they had a prophet who they followed.
Yeah.
And it was a prophet of God who they followed, Yes.
So I found this quote from T.M. Suffield, and he said that the sons of the prophets were a reform movement from within Israel. They had no real cultural power, for all Elisha occasionally spoke with the king in a much less combative role than Elijah had. He also seems much less interested in the monarchy than Elijah was, which is another of the Bible's grand patterns, from priest or servants to king, ruler, to prophet, member of the divine council. Why would you be interested in kings when there are prophets to speak with?
Right.
So it's kind of an interesting then so the sons of the prophets are this, they're basically holding the way.
Right.
And we see Elisha is more interested in talking to people like them than he is talking to kings and governments.
It's interesting because that is how First Kings begins, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have the judges who were in a lot of ways prophetic, right? They heard from God
Yeah.
and they said, go out among these people. Don't do this. And they were judges also because they helped enforce law, as well. Yeah. But what's really interesting here is you have that same idea of God says, why would you want a king when you've got me? And these sons of the prophets were kind of that remnant of those people that were like, yeah, kings are terrible. Let's just go straight to the source. Let's go to the guy who's hearing from God. So these are kind of those early, there are early Jews, but these are kind of like those old school Jews, like the remnant that, because there were some even who were skeptic of Saul, and I mean, obviously, rightfully so, we see that. And so by this point, it's interesting to say, by this point in history of Israel, we've already got a remnant that's like, all right, never mind. We should probably go back to just listening to God.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So this happens, this little situation happens around Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what we see here, 2 Kings 2, 7 through 8, now 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood opposite them at a distance,
mm-hmm.
while the two of them stood by the Jordan, and Elijah took his coat, folded it, and struck the waters, and they were divided here and there so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. So that's the reference for what we've already discussed, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to read that because we'll touch on that here a little bit later. But again, this is the sons of the prophets witnessed all of this,
right?
Recognized all of this. They see that Elisha is the new guy in town.
Right.
Now that gets us to our text, because what happens here is that happens at Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
Elisha then heals some waters there. There's the waters are bad, and I think he pours salt in it. He does something there. It's all right there in 2 Kings.
Right.
And the water is now fresh, and he leaves, and he goes up. He goes up from there to Bethel. Okay, so that's our text, 2 Kings 2, 23 through 25.
Mm-hmm.
So let me read that again. Now he, Elisha, went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up by the road, some young boys came out from the city and ridiculed him and said to him, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head." When he looked behind him and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 of the boys.
Mm-hmm.
He then went on from there to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
and I'm glad all those jokes I've made about Warren being bald have not resulted in any she-bears. That's good to know.
Well, now this is the thing. This is the claim. So we've kind of set up some context. We've kind of set up some backstory here. But the claim about this verse is ultimately that some children came out from the town,
mm-hmm.
ridiculed Elisha for being bald, and so God sent bears to murder them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the question that we have is that what happened?
Yes.
What is happening in this text? Right?
Right.
So the first thing we need to look at is, what does the text mean by young boys?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, this is pretty important.
Right.
The Hebrew word na'ar is used in a broad range and is translated in this text as boys.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's used in Exodus 2:6 to refer to baby Moses.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's right on. 2 Samuel 14:21, it refers to Absalom, who is fully grown at this time.
Right.
So that's not a boy.
Right.
That's not a little boy. And Genesis 22:3, it's used to describe a servant.
Mm-hmm.
In Judges 9:54, it's used to describe an armor bearer. These are not children.
Right.
And 2 Kings 19:6, it's used to describe a king's official.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1 Samuel 2:17, it's used to describe a priest, right?
Correct.
So there are multiple ways this word could be looked at or translated, right?
Right.
Now, the Hebrew adjective used that's translated to young is katan.
Mm-hmm.
And it's used in 1 Kings 11:17 to describe a mature rebel named Hadad the Edomite.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And it's used in 1 Kings 3:7 to describe Solomon when he takes the throne at the age of 20.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, in 1 Kings 3:7, it uses both katan and na'ar.
Mm-hmm.
So the exact same phrase that's used here is used to describe Solomon at the age of 20 when he succeeds his father as the king of Israel.
Yes. It says it literally. If you look at the concordance in the Hebrew concordance to see what it says that word nar is used both as a term of a newborn child, as well as a young man of about the age of 20.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful here because our concept of young and their concept of young, it almost is this especially being used, is not necessarily about their age. It's about their maturity.
Yeah.
Is what's being said.
Yeah.
These were immature men.
Yeah.
And
here's the other aspect of this. Is it in context?
Right.
It could also be referring to their office.
For sure. So
right?
the idea of a servanthood. Yes.
Right. Or a priest.
Yes.
Right. So again, when we look at this now, we look at that and we say, okay, so
these weren't little 10-year-old boys out there like, hey, bald head.
Yeah, these aren't children.
Yeah.
These are, young adults,
These are people who could be tried on grounds of being an adult. Not,
right. It wouldn't go to juvie court.
Right. It wouldn't go to juvie court. Right.
Right. Also, contextually, there are more than 42 of them included in their number because the text says that 42 of them were torn up by the bears.
Right.
That insists that there are more than 42.
So according to stand your ground laws in Missouri, he had the right to defend himself.
Right. Right. Another podcast for another time. Okay, so my question would be, would there be 40 plus children just out and running around? Like, what was this, some kind of field trip? Right? Like, hey, we're going to take the kids to the woods to make fun of the prophets today.
Yeah.
Like, they're talking about public school, right? Okay, so something else I want to point out is notice the prophetic guild, the sons of the prophets.
Yes.
How many of them did they say there were in that chapter? 50.
Okay.
Right? There were 50 sons of the prophets. Mm-hmm. So does that maybe indicate that there's reason to believe there's a guild?
Another?
Right.
Yes.
So if you take all of these cues and the interpretations of these Hebrew words, that you could come to the conclusion that these are adult men who were in a specific group, possibly a priesthood or a specific type of servanthood, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that might mean for the city of Bethel.
Right, sure.
In a minute. So let's say that that's true. These are 40 plus adults who are mocking Elisha.
Right.
Is this not still overkill?
Right.
Right.
100%. Who specifically it says come out.
Right.
It says some small boys is what mine says, came out of the city.
Yeah.
So they were in, they heard, here comes Elisha. He's coming. Let's go out and meet him. Mm-hmm. So
right.
This is like a mob. You know what I mean?
So a mob goes out of their way to confront him.
Yeah.
Now, we always focus on the bald head part.
Yes.
I think what we need to be focused on is the go up part.
Sure.
This is the more important because they say, go up, you bald head, go up. Okay.
Which that shows you that they were like at least teenage, because teenagers are the best at like getting right at like your button, like what you're self-conscious about. Like they'll be like, hey, cool shirt. And you'll be like, oh, I don't want to wear this shirt anymore. These were definitely at least 18-year-old smart Alex who were like, hey, bald head.
Immature for sure.
Yeah, immature. Yeah.
Right. Well, here's the thing. Going up is a reference to what just happened to Elijah when he went up with God.
Right.
Right. So what they're doing is they're chastising Elisha for losing his mentor and for serving God. And they're recommending that he, in effect, die and no longer trouble them or those who do not serve God. Right.
Right.
So being in Bethel, it is believed that these young men may have been involved in idol worship and served at the local shrine. Again, because those words could mean priesthood, servant, right?
Yeah.
So with that in mind, it could also be viewed as a challenge against God, who was responsible for the miraculous calling up of Elijah.
Right.
So, hey, if your God is real, why doesn't he take you up now?
Yeah.
Right? Why don't you use that power to go to him as your master did? Right. And again, though, it's the idea, though, is to get rid of him.
Right. Yeah, you got to understand, go up isn't, they're not just saying like go up the road. They're telling him to die.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
and calling him bald, all in one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly enough, Dr. Michael Heiser brought this up in something I listened to with him, where he talks about the going up to Bethel versus going down to Bethel. He points out that geographically you could not go down to Bethel. But when Elijah at the beginning of this is talking to Elisha, he says, I'm going to go down to Bethel, right? So if we're not talking geographically, to go up in Bethel would mean to go there as a place of honor and worship.
Right.
And they worship false gods in Bethel, right? So for Elijah to go down there was to say that they are not worthy of being held in esteem.
Right.
Because they are.
I'm like lowering myself, basically. Yeah.
And so there's some commentary there that maybe this was also a call out to say you need to go up.
Sure.
To do what we do.
Sure.
In all of those instances, this is not harmless.
Right.
This is threatening.
Right. Most certainly. Yeah.
Others have also noted that anyone of their age of that time would be carrying swords or weapons of some sort.
Sure.
Right? So we've laid a little bit more groundwork.
Right.
Let's talk then about the state of Israel at this time. 2 Kings 3, 1 through 4. So this is right after that.
Right.
Now Jehoram, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel at Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and he reigned for 12 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, though not like his father and his mother, for he removed the memorial stone of Baal, which his father had made. Nevertheless, he clung to the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and to which he misled Israel. He did not abandon them.
Right.
So what we're seeing at this time is that the leaders were corrupt and they were serving other gods. They were creating idols for other gods.
They were bad before. Actually, they were worse before, and they're still bad.
Right.
Right.
Another example of this is 1 Kings 12, 28 through 33. So the king consulted, and he made 2 golden calves, and he said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, Israel, and brought you up from the land of Egypt." And he set one up in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin for the people. For the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. And he made houses on high places and appointed priests from all the people who were not of the sons of Levi. Jeroboam also instituted a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like the feast that is in Judah. And he went up to the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves which he had made. And he stationed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. Then he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, the month that he had devised in his own heart. And he instituted a feast for the sons of Israel and went up to the altar to burn incense.
Right.
Okay. Bethel is basically has been set up as the capital for this false god, this calf.
Right.
Which the king claims delivered Israel from Egypt.
Right.
This is not the truth. This is idolatry, right? So in Bethel, we have a priesthood of people that are tempting and actively leading the people of God astray, coercing them into worshiping a false god, and setting themselves up against what God had commanded. They've invented their own feasts. They've invented their own rituals. They took from houses other than Levi to be the priests. Right. They did all of these things and made a mockery of what God had set up for them and the covenant that they had agreed to as a people.
Right. And I was going to say, in the proximity that he said, the reason why he does this is he says, it's too far to go to Jerusalem.
Right.
So the proximity also assumes or shows that there's a little bit of isolation.
Yeah.
So this is like a Nineveh. You know what I mean? Like this is like a place that is not good.
Yeah.
Like it's a bad place.
Yeah.
So these aren't good people to begin with, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. One of the interesting takes on this here too is as you read this, and I think we need to understand this as people today.
Right.
They're not denying what God did.
Right.
They're redefining who that God is.
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
And that is what we fall into traps so much here today is we're like, well, yes, of course there's a God, but my God is this. Right? Like, well, I like my Jesus to be a little baby Jesus, and I like my Jesus to be in a tuxedo t-shirt.
Right.
Right.
Like party. Yeah.
Yeah. As goofy as that sounds, that's exactly the way we treat God.
100%.
Right? We're going to take the bits that we want and bits that we don't, and we're going to get rid of the bits we don't, and we're going to set up this idol and say that it's that God.
Right.
but it only has the parts that we want. It's more convenient for us,
Right.
Because it's more localized,
Right.
And we're not going to follow any of the statutes that God set up. We're going to do the ones that make sense to us.
Right. And just think, Jesus says, you perverse generation, you ask for a sign, and the only sign you're going to get is a sign of,
Yeah.
like that whole idea. Like that's kind of operating still today, but that's also kind of what's happening. Like I like how you said that. That's what's happening right now in our society and what's happening back then. These were people who saw Elisha and they were like, all right, do something. Do a trick.
Yeah.
Do a trick.
Do a kickflip.
Yeah, do a kickflip. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they hear he's coming out. They insult him.
Yeah.
And they insult God at the same time, saying they're saying your God, our God did this.
Yeah.
Science did this. Whatever you want to. That's put it in the modern terms. That's what's happening, right?
Human secularism did this.
Right. Human secularism. Yeah. Go back and listen to the podcast before. But they're doing that, and doesn't that happen today? Like, hey, if your God was truly real, do a miracle.
Do a thing.
Do something. Do a kickflip.
Yeah.
That's what's happening then. That's what's happening today. 100%. So this kind of gives you a little bit of a context that not only that, when you read who these guys were, even if they're 20-year-olds, even if they're servants, if they're priests, whoever they are, everything they're doing is mocking God.
Right. And
it's daring God to do something.
Right. And it's just the thing is God already did something.
100%.
And they ignored it.
100%.
This is exactly what the Pharisees do to Jesus. Jesus, for the second time, feeds the 5,000. He did it twice.
Right.
The second time he did it,
Yeah.
he leaves where he's at and is immediately confronted by the Pharisees and they say, bring us a sign.
Yeah.
And his answer to them is, it is a wicked,
Right.
a wicked generation
Right.
that demands a sign.
Right.
You will not receive a sign. And what's funny about that is he just gave them a sign.
100%. Yeah.
Right? So,
Yeah.
when we look at what happens here in Bethel and what they did here in setting up this idol, God gave them a sign by leading them out of Egypt.
Right.
And what did they do? They stripped that miracle from him, assigned it to something else, and then turned back to God and said, okay, prove it.
Prove it. Show us. Yeah.
Show us something.
Show us. Yeah.
The burden of proof is on you now,
Yeah,
God.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's where they now are confronting.
Oh, and he's going to do
prophets.
a sign, all right. He's going to do a sign. Yeah.
Yeah. Careful what you ask for.
That's right.
Right? So what we know here is that Bethel is a hotbed for idolatry of the worst kind. And basically they are replacing God with this golden calf. So the last thing I want to talk about is what does it mean that these men were mauled? Right. So the Hebrew word there that's used is bacha. And I don't know if I pronounced that right, but it means to split, to cleave, to break open, or divide. Okay. Now, to give you an idea of how this word can be translated, you can see it in use in Exodus 14, 15 through 16. And you'll recognize this right away. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. As for you, lift up your staff and reach out with your hand over the sea and divide it. For the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. So in Exodus, when Moses parts the sea, the word used to divide the sea is the same word that's used to describe what the bears did to these young men, right? So with our understanding of that word, it does not necessarily mean that these men died, but it could also mean that they did die.
Right.
And at minimum, they were disbanded, divided, and caused to disperse, but could also have received injuries up to and including death.
So I had to look up a word because I didn't even know what the word meant. So if you go back and you look at the lexicon, it says that same thing. It says to cleave asunder. So I had to see what asunder meant, and I was like, asunder means to cleave apart or to divide.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's possible that is a reference to like what the bear's claws did to their bodies. Right?
Sure.
It could also be a reference of what they did to their party when the bears came in.
Everybody ran away.
Everybody ran off.
Right.
42 of them ran off, right?
Yeah.
So we've laid a lot of groundwork.
I like to think the two she-bears went to town just because that's more funny. They call the dude bald, and then the she-bears are like, hey, what's up? Yeah.
They're probably saying, did you hear what they just said?
Yeah. That's what is that comic strip that's like in newspapers? It's like, what is it? It's not like Other Side. It's something.
The Far Side?
Far Side, yeah. That's a good Far Side strip right there. It's just there's 42 guys and two women bears in the woods, and the one's like, did you just hear what they said?
Yeah. Right. So what do we know?
Yeah.
The people who yell at Elisha are not children.
Right.
The people who yell at Elisha traditionally are believed to be idolaters.
Yes.
The people who yell at Elisha are not just ridiculing him for being bald. They are threatening him and challenging him as well as God himself.
Right.
En masse, there are more than 40 plus members wishing death upon this prophet.
Right.
Elisha then curses them in the name of God, which is to say that he puts their judgment and sentencing into God's hands. Right. So I've heard it.
Right.
I've heard it preached before that, and I've heard it like traditionally said, like, oh well, this is a thing. And I heard a rabbi say this actually, that your words carry weight, and you shouldn't just speak them idly because it could result in something like this.
Sure.
I don't think that's what happened here.
No.
He did not wish death upon them.
Right.
He delivered their judgment to God.
Right.
He did not condemn them. He asked God to condemn them.
Right. Do what you need to do, God. Yeah.
Right. He assigned this over to God.
Right.
At that point, 2 bears come out and they maul at least 42 of them. And this could mean that they died, that they were maimed, simply injured, or dispersed, or a combination of all of those things.
Right.
So does any of that matter?
Yeah.
I think, first of all, if we really want to break it down, yeah, it kind of does matter,
100%.
right? Because there's a difference between the destruction or the death of adults who are threatening death upon somebody else,
100%.
or children who are simply mocking someone for being bald.
100%. Right.
Those are two different things, right?
Right.
So does that really matter though?
Well, context is, that's why we said it in the beginning of this. Context is so important, and that's why it's important even here, because if we have to understand, if you read this at face value and you don't know context, you don't understand, it really sounds like God is a really cruel, flippant, like, yep, send him. Like, I'm just going to, like he's angry. He's a mean, vengeful, spiteful God. These poor little boys are just out there going, come on, bald head, and then God's like, all right, I'm going to kill all these children. Okay, well, that's not what's happening.
Right.
That's where I think a lot of people who don't understand this text might get it wrong, is the cruelty of God suddenly comes out. And they begin to question God's decision-making. They begin to question God's ideas of justice.
Yeah.
So because this is suddenly now, this God is not a good God. This God flippantly kills children who who insult his prophet.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
right. And so is that an overreach of God's justice?
100%. Right.
That's the question, right?
Right.
And so here's what I would say, and I think you're in agreement with me on this. We'll find out here in a second.
Right.
Let's say it's either or.
Sure.
Okay. Let's say that everything we just said is 100% true.
Right.
Right. That this was a threatening mob of idolaters wishing death upon
likely armed young men.
Yeah.
Yeah. 42 of them.
wishing death upon the prophet.
Right.
And the prophet gives it over to God, and God judges them and destroys them.
Right.
Right. In some fashion.
Right.
And then let's just say, okay, well, what if you just took it at face value?
Sure.
And you didn't look at the context, you didn't look at the text, you didn't look at the Hebrew words.
And this really is some
You
children.
read it at face value.
42 kids on a field trip outside the city.
Right? You could take both of those and you can still ask the question, is God ultimately evil for his actions?
Right.
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 And I think where that brings us is that we need to understand the justice of God.
100%.
Right? Because what I would say is, even if you were right that these were children
Right.
who were just mocking
Right.
the prophet, if it is God's justice, it is good justice.
Sure.
And there is a reason and a purpose for him to condemn
Right.
in this fashion.
Right. God does not do unfairness,
Right. Now,
especially when it comes to justice.
now for the unbeliever,
Right.
that's going to be a lot like, well, you're just saying God's ways are higher than his. You're just making excuses for
Right.
God, right? And it's interesting to hear that from somebody who doesn't believe in objective morality, but nonetheless,
Right.
we're going to explain this, right?
Right.
So,
Well, I think if you take it for the value we've kind of argued for, because I do think when you interpret the text the way it's supposed to be meant and read, there's a reason why the story was not added, as we said initially, the story was not added into this text because the author thought it was a funny tale. There's a reason why. And he also wasn't like, the reason is because God loves to kill children. No, that's not why either. The reason why is the author is showing this is what happens to idolaters who question and make fun of
Yeah.
God.
Well, what happened with Elijah?
Right.
With the idolaters who went up against him?
I mean, they were consumed with fire. So
Yeah, God consumed them with fire when they challenged him in God, right?
Right.
So this is actually 100% in lockstep consistency for God.
Right.
Is you have set yourself against me, so now I must respond.
Right. Don't challenge God, you know, and God also kind of has a sense of humor.
Right.
You know, he could have rained fire down again, but he's like, there's bears close by, you know. But so I think if you interpret the way we interpret it, and I think the way it's probably meant to be interpreted, I say probably because we're not the end all be all authority on the Bible, but let's just say we're going with this. I think people are more inclined to say, okay, it is a little. That response is a little more justified. These are people not wishing him well. They're threatening him. They're mature enough to know they shouldn't be doing this, especially in a Jewish culture where that to make fun of an elder in and of itself is a sin. You know, okay, that's more justified. But if you go to the other side of the argument and you say, okay, everything you've said isn't wrong. Literally, this is just in there because the author thought this was a really funny thing that needed to be added into the Bible. And they really were children and they really were torn to pieces by bears. You begin to be a little more or a little less, rather, sympathetic to what God does.
Right.
But that's because you don't, as you just said, understand God.
Right. You don't understand his judgment.
Right.
You don't understand his holiness. You know, I think it's interesting. You were saying that, and another piece of this that people don't understand is that the people of Israel were actively and voluntarily in a committed relationship with God.
Right.
They were in a covenant with God.
Right.
And they were in breach of terms.
Right.
It's interesting. I heard this before, and it changes the way you think about this. You know, the Spanish Inquisition.
Right.
Famous for breaking in and like putting people to death, right?
No one expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Exactly.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So would you be interested to know that the only people, first of all, they never put anyone to death?
I didn't know that. No.
They were simply the people who came in and gave the impartial trial. So you were not on trial by the people who were there in the town.
Okay.
Right? So they would come in and they would give the trial. So they never actually put anybody to death, but they may have been the ones who condemned them.
Okay,
right?
sure.
The other aspect of that is that they never condemned somebody who was not an active member of the church. So the only people they ever cast judgment on were people who said that they were in belief of the scriptures and basically made a commitment to the church.
Right, sure.
And then they come in and they say, but
they're covenant enforcers.
Right.
Yeah.
But you're not following that and you're practicing the opposite of that. You're practicing witchcraft. You're practicing these things, right? So like the way that always gets characterized is that they were just roaming the countryside looking for any and everyone that was pagan and putting them to death for not believing the way they believed.
Thanks, Monty Python.
Right, yeah. But that was not the case.
Right, sure.
That was not the case at all. What they were doing was enforcing the rules that you had committed to.
Sure.
Does it change your opinion?
Right.
If you say, look, I am committing to this rule of law,
Sure,
and then to be held under that rule of law,
right.
Does it change your opinion of that?
Well, and here's the reality. The Bible makes it very clear from the get-go. It doesn't matter if you agree with God or believe in God. There will be judgment.
Somewhere, yeah.
You will be held accountable.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what's often lost when we understand God's ideas of justice and judgment and mercy and grace and things like that. Because there will be a time, and a lot of us assume that time is supernatural after death.
Yeah.
That's not always the case.
It's not always the case.
Because I think we also have to understand, and we always talk about this, and I always say this, God is a God of consequences.
Yeah.
Consequences are felt, worldly, tangible judgments. And I don't mean that in a negative. God, like I was talking to you earlier, Billy Graham said that God never sends a single person to hell. And he's right. He didn't. We send ourselves, right? God just simply pays you what you've owed.
Right.
And if you don't have Jesus to front the bill, we're all screwed, right? And so but I say all that to say, especially in the Old Testament, who does not have Jesus,
right?
We have to understand that it doesn't matter whether they believed in Elisha and Elijah, and Elisha and Elisha's God. Sorry, I said Elisha twice. Elisha and Elijah, they're God. It doesn't matter if they believed in that one or that calf. God was still real and holding them, as you said, even though they're actively Israelites, he's going to hold everybody to that.
Right. Well, something that Frank Turk, I've heard him say, is he has asked the question, does God actually murder people?
Right.
if we're eternal beings and he is the judge of all of us, does
Right.
he murder someone or does he move them to their next reality?
Right.
And that's an interesting way to consider that and to look at that, because he doesn't actually kill anybody. But then we think about, where does the expression playing God come from?
Sure.
Right? There is an understanding that God is the one who gets to determine when life ends and when it begins.
Right.
He does get to have a say in that based on his judgments and his predispositions. The problem we always run into is we want to make those same judgments on our own without the sight that God has.
Right.
So we don't get to play God because God is God.
Right.
And God is just and he is righteous. And when he does something, it is for righteous purposes.
Right.
So let me read a quote from R.C. Sproul. And this is from a chapter in his book, The Holiness of God. And R.C. Sproul says, "The judge of heaven and earth did right. No innocent people were punished. God's justice is never divorced from his righteousness. He never condemns the innocent. He never clears the guilty. He never punishes with undue severity. He never fails to reward righteousness. His justice is perfect justice." Kung asked the right question. The issue is not why does God punish sin, but why does he permit the ongoing human rebellion? What prince, what king, what ruler would display so much patience with a continually rebellious populace?
100%.
Right. So he mentions Kung. Kung basically posited the question, essentially, why are we so concerned with God's judgment when what we should really be amazed by is God's grace? Right. We all stand under judgment. We are all found guilty and wanting. We are all deserving of death. Now, this is the problem with those who have an issue with these stories is they don't believe that's true. They don't believe they deserve death. They don't believe they're awful people. Because their morality and their righteousness is subjective to how they feel internally. It's not being placed against a holy God.
It talks, and that speaks to the scripture's righteousness of God, who says, "Don't count God slow, that he wishes none shall perish." I think that's the idea here. Is judgment will happen, and it will be fair. It will be everything you've earned and deserved, and God's grace, which is Jesus, says, "I'll take that upon myself." So that you can be made holy. You see, so the grace idea and judgment is Jesus. It's Jesus. But you're still going to answer. I mean, I say that a little tongue in cheek here. You're still going to answer, yes. You're going to have to answer for every sin you've ever committed. It's whether you're going to have enough money to front the bill, And Jesus is the only amount of money that's going to get you.
You'll never have that money. And
Exactly.
That's the thing is you get to make the determination. Of who's going to be responsible for paying your debt. Is it going to be you or is it going to be Jesus? Right. And you and I have talked about this before. We talk about the people of Canaan and like, oh, well, God was unjust for driving them out or slaughtering them or doing whatever. And yet God tells you, I have allowed them to live in wickedness for over 400 years. Right? So for over 400 years, he's
given them grace.
He stayed his wrath. And then he finally judges them, and now it's an awful thing. Right? And we see that with the law. He says he gave them the law to hold back his justice, to hold back his wrath. God is always giving you grace and mercy and opportunity. And when we read stuff like this at face value, what we do is we discard all of that. We discard every bit of everything that he has ever done that has been gracious and merciful. Because that's what we expect him to be. But when he is just, and justice is a good thing. Like you wouldn't be a social justice warrior if you didn't think justice was right. Do you know what I'm saying? So, justice is a good thing. People are supposed to be held accountable. The question is, do you believe that God has the right to hold you accountable? Or not. And
justice at the expense of another is not justice. You see, that's why playing God, like you said, I love that you said that earlier because it's the truth. Playing God is saying that this is at the expense of someone. God's justice is never at the expense of anybody but the person. That's why he's the final judgment. That's why he's it. There's nothing after him. And I think that puts this text into context a little more is Elisha does not play God.
Right.
He doesn't. There, and it's interesting. Up until this point, we've had many words that Elisha has said. We've had many phrases. We literally with the woman, like you said, in the water and the infertility, and he tells her to do this to the water, to go to the spring and blah blah. You know, we have all his language there. We have no language here. Partly because Elijah didn't say kill them. He did. You know, he does. There's nothing worth saying that Elijah says.
Right.
Elisha gives it over to God. He curses them, and God. He says, "God, you deal with them."
Yeah.
And it's God's justice and judgment that does it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important to understand because even if they were, as we talked about, and we go back and say, even if these were 42 little small boys all hanging out, calling this guy bald, God's sense of justice and judgment is fair.
Yeah.
Meaning just like bring that to the Canaanites, it's fair. We don't know what these boys have done. We don't know. It's not just because they're making. You see what I'm saying? Like God is not. He's slow to anger.
Right.
Like that's one of his characteristics. That's what he tells us to do. He gives grace, and so I think people who read this, especially when they're reading this with a critical lens, and they want to say, see, your God is flippant and your God is whatever. They don't understand They don't see the whole story. Literally, we don't even see the whole story. We don't know. If we take it for what we say, okay, we've got a little better picture of the story of, okay, these are young men who are idol worshipers and blah, 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 blah. We don't know the whole story. Only God does that. And that's why the Bible also tells us we give grace, not judgment.
Right.
Because God's saying by that, we talked about this, maybe it was last episode even, about using the measure which you use will be used against you. Like that's the idea here is God saying, okay, you're using a measure, let me measure that back to you.
Right.
You know, and when and where he exercises that's up to God. And I think that as a Christian, we need to hear that. Because I think a lot of us are like, I've got time. I've got time to do better. I've got time to try more. I've got time. But the Bible constantly is saying there's not enough time. You need to start making changes today.
Yeah. And Jesus tells us to even pray this way.
Sure.
Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Right.
This is the model.
Right.
It's not to proclaim what we want done.
Right.
They were not judged under Elisha's embarrassment.
Right.
They were judged by the righteousness of God.
God. Exactly right. Yeah.
So let me read you another quote from R.C. Sproul on the holiness of God. And it's interesting. He talks a little bit about the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's kind of this divide. People look at the God of the Old Testament and question whether or not it's the same God of the New Testament. And he says, the false conflict between the two testaments may be seen in the most brutal act of divine vengeance ever recorded in Scripture. It is not found in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament. The most violent expression of God's wrath and justice is seen on the cross. If ever a person had room to complain of injustice, it was Jesus. He was the only innocent man ever to be punished by God. If we stagger at the wrath of God, let us stagger at the cross. Here is where our astonishment should be focused. If we have cause for moral outrage, let it be directed at Golgotha.
100%.
Right? This is amazing because this is so true. We are so mad at God holding us accountable when what should upset us or give us turmoil is that Jesus took that payment.
The injustice of Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus bore that.
Right.
By his own accord, by his desire. This is what he desired to do for you, is to accept God's wrath in your place, even though he was innocent.
Right.
He didn't deserve it.
It's funny. We want to advocate for the two criminals on the cross next to him, but not the one who shouldn't even be on the cross to begin with.
Right.
You know, it's funny.
Exactly.
Right.
Right. And you know, like the conversation will come out and people, well, should he even have to be there? And
Sure.
all of these things, you know, but the truth is, at the end of the day, yes.
Yeah,
somebody has to be there.
He didn't have to be there, but he went because of his grace and love for you, so you could be there with him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you get to choose.
Right.
Who goes up there?
Right.
Jesus or you?
Right.
Right. I'm choosing Jesus.
Yeah, for sure.
And then only in a way that is grateful, not in a way that is to like
fear. No.
Not like, oh, I want to avoid it, so put Jesus up there.
Right.
Not in a condemning way, but in a way of like wonder and awe that he would even choose to do that.
That demands a response of your life and changing.
Right.
That's what the gospel is about. It's not just about Jesus going to the cross. It's about our response to the cross.
Right.
It changes everything, including us and how we live and what we do. And it's a gratitude
Yeah.
why we live this way. I don't live this way because I'm worried about going to hell, and I don't live this way because I live this way because a guy who did nothing wrong, not only a guy, but a God,
Yeah.
who did nothing wrong, died for me.
Yeah.
The least I can do is live for him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think that's justice.
Yeah.
It ain't fair for you. It ain't fair for Jesus. But Jesus says that's cool. Why? Because he's God. He's the author of fairness. He says, I'll make it fair.
I'll make it fair.
I'll calculate the stuff. Don't worry. Yeah.
Yeah. So I hope what we've done here is shed a little bit of light on what the scripture actually says here in 2 Kings 2, what actually happened.
Yes.
But despite all of that we've maybe had and I would love to have a broader discussion on this somewhere down the road.
Right.
Shed some light on what the justice of God is, why it's important, why it's necessary, and how we should be approaching it.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, God did put that on his son for us.
Sure.
So that we don't have to be mauled by bears.
Right.
Right.
That's one of the tortures in hell. Yeah. The she-bears.
The she-bears just mauling people.
Oh, God.
Man. So anyway, if you listen this far, thank you for listening. We hope this gives you something to ponder, something to go further with, and something to consider. Please do so in earnest and in a desire to learn.
Yeah.
I don't go after these as a way to try. I don't dig into these things as a way to try to disprove somebody.
Sure.
I hope anybody else that is listening doesn't do the same.
Sure.
Scripture is not a weapon.
No.
It's in truth, it's a mirror.
Sure.
And it shows me just how awful I truly am.
Sure. 100%. Right.
Which then requires me to make a choice.
Yeah.
Right.
For sure.
So I hope that those listening or watching this will make a choice today.
Yeah. Don't wait.
Don't wait. And you know what? Choose the drums.
Choose the drums. Choose the drums.
Choose the
drums. Don't wait for those drums. I don't want to wait.
I don't want to wait for these drums to be over.